Marcus Johnson had always been a quiet kid, the kind who preferred to blend into the background rather than stand out. But blending in wasn't easy when you were new in town, especially when your family moved to a place where everyone seemed to know each other already. Lincoln Middle School was nothing like his old school back in the city. The classrooms felt smaller, the hallways narrower, and the students, well, they weren't exactly welcoming. On his very first day, Marcus walked into the building clutching his backpack tightly, feeling more nervous than he cared to admit. His mom had told him over breakfast that morning, "Just be yourself, Marcus. You're going to do great." But being himself didn't seem so simple when all eyes turned toward him as he entered the classroom. The teacher, Mrs. Harper, stood at the front of the room with her arms crossed. She looked strict, her sharp glasses perched on her nose, her gray hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her lips pressed together in what could only be described as a permanent frown. When she called roll, her voice carried an edge that made every student sit up straighter. When she got to Marcus's name, she paused. "Marcus Johnson," she said slowly, dragging out the syllables, as if testing how they sounded. Then, without looking up from her clipboard, she added, "Well, I suppose we'll see if you can keep up here at Lincoln. Not everyone fits in everywhere, after all." The comment hung heavy in the air, and Marcus felt his cheeks burn. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on finding a seat near the back of the room. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Harper's words weren't just about academics. They were about him, about his skin color, about the fact that he stuck out in a sea of faces that all looked alike. As the day went on, Marcus noticed little things. Some kids whispered behind their hands when he passed by. Others avoided eye contact altogether. And then there was Mrs. Harper, whose attitude seemed colder toward him than anyone else. During lunch, he sat alone at a corner table, picking at his sandwich while trying not to let the whispers get to him. One boy nearby muttered something under his breath about city kids, but Marcus pretended not to hear. By the time music class rolled around later that afternoon, Marcus was exhausted. Music had always been something he enjoyed. It reminded him of weekends spent listening to his grandmother play hymns on the piano. But this class felt different. As soon as he walked in, Mrs. Harper glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Take a seat," she instructed sharply, pointing to an empty chair near the front. The room smelled faintly of polish and dust, and rows of chairs faced a shiny black piano at the center of the stage. Marcus slid into his seat, hoping to disappear again. But Mrs. Harper wasn't done singling him out. As she explained the day's lesson, a unit on classical composers, she stopped mid-sentence and turned directly to him. "You've probably never heard of these pieces before, have you?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Marcus clenched his fists under the desk, biting back a retort. Instead, he forced himself to nod politely. Deep down, though, he vowed not to let her, or anyone else, make him feel small. Little did he know, this moment would set the stage for something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. The next day in music class, Mrs. Harper stood at the front of the room with a clipboard in one hand and a stern expression on her face. "Today," she announced, tapping her pen against the board, "we're starting something new. Each of you will perform a short piece on the piano as part of your grade." A collective groan rippled through the classroom. Most students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many had never touched a piano before, let alone played one. Mrs. Harper ignored their protests and continued explaining the assignment. She listed off famous classical pieces like Für Elise by Beethoven and Clair de Lune by Debussy, acting as though everyone in the room was already familiar with them. When she finally turned to Marcus, her gaze lingered just a little too long. "And don't worry, Marcus," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm sure you'll manage just fine. After all, improvisation is, well, it's practically second nature to some people, isn't it?" Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. The other students glanced between Marcus and Mrs. Harper, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Some snickered nervously, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Marcus felt his stomach twist into knots, but he refused to let her see how much her comments stung. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, pretending not to notice the tension building around him. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Marcus packed up his things slowly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. As he walked out into the hallway, he could hear whispers trailing behind him. "Did you hear what she said?" Someone muttered. Another voice replied, "Yeah, that was kind of messed up." But no one stepped forward to say anything directly to Mrs. Harper or to defend Marcus. It was as if everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his room, staring at the old keyboard his grandmother had given him years ago. It wasn't fancy. It had chipped keys and a crack down the side. But it still worked. His younger sister, Tia, peeked her head into the doorway. "Hey, Marcus," she said softly, sensing his mood. "You okay?" He shrugged, not wanting to talk about it. But Tia wasn't one to give up easily. She plopped down beside him and tilted her head curiously. "What's wrong? Was it that teacher again?" Marcus hesitated before nodding. "She thinks I can't do it," he admitted quietly. "She thinks I'll fail." Tia frowned, crossing her arms over her chest. "Well, show her she's wrong. You've got ears, don't you? Just figure it out." Her confidence surprised him, and for the first time that day, Marcus cracked a small smile. Maybe Tia was right. Maybe he didn't need formal lessons or expensive equipment to prove himself. All he needed was determination, and maybe a little bit of faith in his own abilities. Over the next few days, Marcus threw himself into practicing. Every spare moment he had, he spent hunched over the keyboard, teaching himself the basics. At first, his fingers stumbled awkwardly over the keys, producing jumbled notes that made Tia cringe theatrically. "Oh, Marcus," she teased, "you're killing my ears." But as the hours passed, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly but surely, Marcus started finding patterns. Notes that once sounded chaotic began to flow together, forming melodies that filled the tiny living room with warmth. His parents noticed the change too. One evening, his dad leaned against the doorway, sipping coffee, and listened intently as Marcus worked through a simple scale. "You know," his dad said thoughtfully, "your grandma used to play like that. She always said music came from the heart, not the hands." Marcus paused, looking up at his father. "Do you think I can really pull this off?" he asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. His dad smiled warmly. "Absolutely. Just keep going. Show them what you're made of." Even though Marcus felt more confident than before, he couldn't shake the weight of Mrs. Harper's expectations, or lack thereof. He knew she hadn't assigned this project to help him grow. She'd done it to humiliate him. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Marcus realized that her intentions didn't matter. What mattered was how he responded. If he gave up now, he'd be proving her right. But if he pushed forward, he might just surprise everyone, including himself. By the time the week ended, Marcus had chosen his piece, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It wasn't easy, but something about its haunting melody spoke to him. With each practice session, he grew more determined to master it, not just for himself, but to prove that talent couldn't be measured by prejudice. Little did he know, his performance was about to leave an impact far greater than he ever imagined. Marcus's fingers hovered over the worn keys of his grandmother's old keyboard as he stared at the sheet music spread out in front of him. The notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata looked impossibly complicated at first glance, like a maze of black dots and lines that made no sense. But Marcus wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He took a deep breath, placed his hands on the keys, and began. At first, it was chaos. His fingers stumbled clumsily over the notes, hitting wrong keys and creating jarring sounds that made Tia wince from across the room. "Marcus," she groaned dramatically, covering her ears with both hands. "You're killing me here." Despite her teasing tone, There was a sparkle of encouragement in her eyes. She knew how hard he was trying, and she wanted him to succeed. But Marcus didn't let the mistakes discourage him. Instead, he broke the piece down into smaller parts, tackling each section one at a time. Slowly, painfully, he started piecing things together. By the third day of practice, he could play the opening bars without too many errors. By the fifth day, the melody began to take shape, flowing softly under his fingertips like water trickling over smooth stones. And by the seventh day, something magical happened. For the first time, the music sounded right. It wasn't just about hitting the correct notes anymore. As Marcus played, he poured his emotions into the piece, the frustration of Mrs. Harper's cruel words, the loneliness of being the new kid, the quiet determination to prove himself. Each note carried a piece of his heart, turning what had once been a daunting assignment into something deeply personal. When he reached the end of the sonata, even Tia stopped teasing long enough to clap enthusiastically. "You're actually good at this," she said, grinning. "Like, really good." Marcus smiled faintly, though his mind was already racing ahead. He knew he still had work to do before the performance, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could pull this off. One evening, as he practiced late into the night, his mom walked into the living room holding a cup of hot cocoa. She set it down beside him and listened quietly for a moment. Then, with a soft smile, she said, "You know, Marcus, your grandma used to say that music is like a conversation. You don't just play the notes, you tell a story." Her words stuck with him. Over the next few days, Marcus focused not just on perfecting the technical aspects of the piece, but also on telling its story. He imagined the composer sitting alone at a piano centuries ago, pouring his soul into the music. He thought about the sadness and longing behind the melody, and he tried to channel those feelings through his own playing. With every practice session, the piece became less about proving Mrs. Harper wrong and more about honoring the beauty of the music itself. Meanwhile, word of Marcus's dedication began to spread, at least within his family. His dad would often stop by the living room after dinner to listen, nodding approvingly as Marcus worked through difficult sections. Even his little brother, who usually preferred loud video games to anything remotely quiet, started lingering nearby, mesmerized by the sound of the piano. For the first time since moving to the small town, Marcus felt a sense of belonging, not because anyone outside his home accepted him, but because his family rallied around him in ways that mattered most. Still, despite his growing confidence, Marcus couldn't shake the looming shadow of Mrs. Harper. Every time he pictured her smirking face or heard her sarcastic comments echoing in his mind, doubt crept in. What if he messed up during the performance? What if she found some way to twist his efforts into another insult? These fears gnawed at him, threatening to undo all the progress he'd made. "I don't know if I can do this," Marcus admitted quietly. "What if she doesn't care how hard I worked? What if none of it matters?" Taya frowned, thinking for a moment. Then, with surprising seriousness, she said, "So what? Who cares what she thinks? You're doing this for you, not her. If you play your best, then you win, no matter what she says." Her words hit home. Marcus realized that Tia was right. It didn't matter what Mrs. Harper thought. All that mattered was giving his all and staying true to himself. From that moment on, Marcus approached his practice sessions with renewed focus. He stopped worrying about impressing others and instead concentrated on making the music speak for itself. By the time the performance date arrived, Marcus felt ready, or as ready as he could be. He may not have had years of formal training, but he had something just as valuable: heart. And as he stood backstage waiting for his turn, he reminded himself of why he was there. Not to silence Mrs. Harper, though that might happen. Not to prove anyone wrong, though he hoped they. The day of the piano performances finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the music room was thick with tension. Rows of chairs had been set up for the students who weren't performing, and Mrs. Harper stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, wearing her usual stern expression. She called each student up one by one, their nervousness evident as they stumbled through their pieces. Some forgot the notes entirely, others played haltingly, and a few managed to get through without any glaring mistakes, but none of them stood out. The room remained quiet, save for the occasional polite applause that felt more like an obligation than genuine appreciation. Marcus sat near the back, his hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he watched his classmates take their turns. Each performance seemed to drag on longer than the last, and every time Mrs. Harper scribbled something on her clipboard, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what she'd write about him when it was his turn. Would she criticize him, no matter how well he played? Or worse, would she dismiss his effort entirely? Finally, after what felt like hours, Mrs. Harper glanced down at her list and said, "Next, we have Marcus Johnson." Her tone was clipped, almost smug, as if she already knew how this would end. A few students turned to look at Marcus, some curious, others clearly expecting him to fail. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand tall as he walked toward the piano. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he refused to let his nerves show. Not now, not in front of her. As Marcus settled onto the bench, Mrs. Harper leaned casually against the piano, arms crossed, watching him with an unreadable expression. In a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, she muttered, "Let's see if all those hours practicing paid off, or if this is just another wasted effort." A few students giggled nervously, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, focusing on the sound of his own breathing. He reminded himself why he was here, not for her approval, but because he owed it to himself to try. When he opened his eyes, he placed his fingers gently on the keys and began to play. The first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata floated softly into the air, tentative at first, but quickly gaining strength. As the melody unfolded, something remarkable happened. The entire room fell silent. There were no whispers, no fidgeting, no awkward coughs, just the hauntingly beautiful music filling every corner of the space. Mrs. Harper froze mid-smirk, her pen hovering uselessly over her clipboard. Her sharp gaze softened slightly as she listened, though she tried, and failed, to hide her surprise. Even the students who had teased Marcus before were completely captivated, leaning forward in their seats as if afraid to miss a single note. For the first time since he'd arrived at Lincoln Middle School, Marcus held everyone's attention, not because he was different or new, but because he was undeniably talented. As the piece progressed, Marcus lost himself in the music. He wasn't thinking about Mrs. Harper's judgmental stares or the skeptical faces of his classmates. All that mattered was the story he was telling through the piano, a story of struggle, resilience, and hope. His fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, weaving together notes that spoke louder than words ever could. By the time he reached the final chords, the room was so still you could hear a pin drop. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, as if waking from a trance, the entire class erupted into applause. It wasn't the polite clapping they'd given the other performers. It was genuine, enthusiastic, and full of admiration. Some students even stood up, cheering loudly. Marcus blinked, startled by the reaction, and slowly rose from the bench. He glanced around the room, meeting the wide-eyed stares of his classmates, before finally turning to Mrs. Harper. Her face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the shock in her eyes. She stared at him for a long moment, her mouth slightly agape, before snapping her clipboard shut and clearing her throat. "Well," she said stiffly, though her voice lacked its usual edge. "That was unexpected." The comment might have stung under different circumstances, but Marcus barely noticed. He walked back to his seat, his head held high, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't need her validation, not anymore. Because for the first time since stepping foot in that classroom, Marcus knew he belonged. And Not Mrs. Harper's prejudice, not the whispers of his classmates, not even his own doubts, could take that away from him. The applause lingered in the air, echoing through the music room like a tidal wave of approval that no one had expected, not even Marcus himself. For a moment, he stood frozen near the piano, unsure of what to do next. His classmates were still clapping, some of them whistling or cheering as if they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. And in a way they had. The same boy who'd been singled out and mocked by Mrs. Harper was now basking in a spotlight he never asked for, but couldn't ignore. Marcus finally managed to move, his legs feeling oddly heavy as he walked back to his seat. As he passed rows of students, he noticed subtle changes in their expressions. Some looked genuinely impressed, others seemed embarrassed for having doubted him, and a few even gave him shy smiles. It wasn't unanimous praise, but it was enough to make Marcus realize that something had shifted. Maybe not everything, but at least something. Mrs. Harper, meanwhile, remained rooted to her spot near the piano, her clipboard dangling loosely at her side. Her usual sharp demeanor had cracked, replaced by an awkward stiffness that made her seem almost human. She glanced down at her notes, then back up at Marcus, as if trying to reconcile the performance she'd just witnessed with the preconceived notions she'd held about him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she cleared her throat and said in a clipped tone, "Thank you, Marcus. That will be all." Her words landed flat, devoid of warmth or acknowledgement, but they didn't sting as much as they might have before. Marcus simply nodded and slid into his seat, ignoring the murmurs rippling through the room. One student whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Wow, I didn't know he could play like that." Another added, "Seriously, why isn't he in band or something?" The comments weren't perfect. They carried traces of surprise tinged with disbelief. But they were better than silence, better than judgment. As the rest of the performances continued, Marcus found it hard to focus. His mind kept replaying the moment when the room went quiet, when every eye turned toward him not out of mockery but awe. He thought about how Mrs. Harper's smirk had faltered, how her pen hovered uselessly over her clipboard, as if she couldn't decide whether to critique him or admit defeat. Most of all, he thought about the power of music, the way it transcended words, expectations, and even prejudice. After class ended, several students approached Marcus in the hallway, offering compliments that ranged from sincere to slightly awkward. "Dude, that was insane," one boy said, giving him a fist bump. A girl named Emily, who rarely spoke to anyone outside her close-knit group, shyly admitted, "I've never heard anyone play like that before. You're really talented." Each comment chipped away at the invisible wall that had surrounded Marcus since his first day at Lincoln Middle School. Slowly but surely, he began to feel less like an outsider and more like someone who belonged. But perhaps the most surprising reaction came later that afternoon during study hall. Marcus was sitting alone at a table in the library when Mrs. Harper appeared, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She hesitated for a moment, glancing around the nearly empty room before approaching him. "Marcus," she began, her voice unusually soft. I didn't expect. Well, I suppose I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was closer than Marcus had anticipated. He looked up at her, meeting her gaze steadily. After a pause, he replied, "Music doesn't care who you are. It speaks for itself." His words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Mrs. Harper blinked, taken aback, then gave a curt nod before turning to leave. As she walked away, Marcus noticed her shoulders slump slightly, as though carrying the weight of unspoken regrets. That night, as Marcus lay in bed replaying the day's events in his mind, he realized something important. His performance hadn't just changed how others saw him. It had changed how he saw himself. For so long, he'd let Mrs. Harper's words define him, letting her sarcasm chip away at his confidence. But now, for the first time, he understood that talent wasn't something you could measure by skin color or background. It was something deeper, something earned through effort and passion. And while Marcus knew this wouldn't erase every challenge he faced, it gave him hope. Hope that people could change. Hope that music could bridge divides. And hope that sometimes even the hardest hearts could soften when confronted with undeniable greatness. The days following Marcus's piano performance felt different, like a subtle shift in the air that everyone noticed, but no one could quite explain. Word of his incredible playing spread quickly through Lincoln Middle School, traveling from classroom to cafeteria in hushed whispers and excited chatter. Students who had barely acknowledged him before now greeted him with nods or smiles in the hallways. Even teachers seemed to treat him differently, their tones warmer, their expectations higher. It was as if his performance had rewritten the script they'd all been following since his arrival. Mrs. Harper, however, remained an enigma. While she hadn't outright apologized for her earlier behavior, her attitude toward Marcus began to soften in small, almost imperceptible ways. During music class, she stopped making sarcastic remarks about his abilities and instead focused on critiquing his technique, not out of cruelty, but with genuine intent to help him improve. When assigning new pieces for practice, she handed Marcus sheet music that was slightly more advanced than what she gave the others, clearly recognizing his potential. Though she never explicitly praised him, her actions spoke volumes. One afternoon, after dismissing the rest of the class, Mrs. Harper called Marcus aside. "I've decided," she said stiffly, adjusting her glasses, "that you'll lead a short workshop next week for the younger students. They're struggling with rhythm, and I think hearing from someone closer to their age might, well, it might resonate better." Her voice trailed off awkwardly, as though admitting this was difficult for her. Marcus blinked in surprise. Leading a workshop for younger students, the idea both thrilled and terrified him. He hesitated before responding, unsure of how much trust to place in her sudden change of heart. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said simply. "I'll do it." Over the weekend, Marcus prepared carefully for the workshop, practicing not just his own playing but also thinking about how to explain concepts like timing and dynamics in ways that kids could understand. His little sister, Tia, proved to be an unexpected asset, offering playful critiques as he tested out explanations on her. "No one wants to hear boring stuff," she advised sagely. "Make it fun." So Marcus incorporated games into his lesson plan, using clapping exercises and simple melodies to teach rhythm. By the time Monday rolled around, he felt ready, or at least as ready as he could be. On the day of the workshop, a group of wide-eyed sixth graders filed into the music room, whispering nervously among themselves. Some looked skeptical when they saw Marcus standing at the front of the room, clearly younger than most teachers. But as soon as he started speaking, and especially when he began demonstrating techniques on the piano, their skepticism melted away. They leaned forward eagerly, raising their hands to ask questions or volunteering to try exercises themselves. By the end of the session, even the shyest students were laughing and clapping along to the rhythms Marcus had taught them. As the kids filed out, several of them thanked him enthusiastically. One boy lingered behind, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Can I show you something?" he asked timidly. Before Marcus could respond, the boy sat down at the piano and played a halting but heartfelt rendition of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." When he finished, his face flushed with pride. Marcus grinned and gave him a thumbs up. "That was awesome," he said sincerely. "Keep practicing. You'll get even better." Watching the boy beam with joy reminded Marcus of why he loved music so much. It brought people together, breaking down barriers that words often couldn't. And while leading the workshop didn't magically erase all the challenges he faced at school, it gave him a sense of purpose, a reminder that his talent could inspire others, just as his grandmother's playing had once inspired him. Later that week, Marcus overheard two teachers discussing the workshop during lunch. "Did you see how engaged those kids were?" one of them remarked. "And Marcus, he's such a natural teacher. Who would have thought?" The other teacher nodded in agreement. "It's amazing what happens when we give students a chance to shine." Though Marcus didn't say anything, he smiled to himself as he walked away. For the first time, He felt like more than just the new kid or the black boy who plays piano. He felt seen, not because of what others expected of him, but because of who he truly was. And while Mrs. Harper still wasn't perfect, her moments of kindness were often tinged with hesitation. He could tell she was trying. That alone gave him hope that even the hardest hearts could learn to listen, one note at a time. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus found himself in a position he never imagined. When he first stepped foot into Lincoln Middle School, respected, the boy who had once been an outsider, mocked and underestimated, was now someone others looked up to, not just for his musical talent, but for the quiet strength he carried with him every day. His performance on the piano wasn't just a fleeting moment of applause. It became a turning point that reshaped how people saw him and how he saw himself. Music became Marcus's anchor at school. He joined the choir as an accompanist, his fingers dancing across the keys during rehearsals while singers harmonized around him. At first, some members hesitated to work closely with him, unsure of how to bridge the gap between their worlds. But Marcus didn't let their initial awkwardness bother him. Instead, he focused on the music, letting its universal language speak louder than any words could. Slowly, barriers began to fall. By the end of the semester, students sought him out for advice on tricky pieces or asked if he'd play alongside them during talent shows. Music brought them together in ways nothing else could. Outside of choir, Marcus formed a small band with a few classmates who shared his passion for rhythm and melody. They called themselves the Hidden Notes, a nod to Marcus's journey of discovering his own hidden talents. The group practiced after school in the basement of the community center, experimenting with everything from jazz standards to pop covers. Their energy was infectious, drawing curious neighbors and younger kids who wanted to learn. Even Tia tagged along sometimes, cheering them on with her trademark enthusiasm. "You guys are gonna be famous," she'd shout, clapping wildly after each song. Mrs. Harper, too, showed signs of change, small ones, but noticeable all the same. She no longer singled Marcus out in class, nor did she make snide comments about his abilities. In fact, she started assigning him solos during school concerts, introducing him to the audience with phrases like, "Marcus has shown us time, and again what dedication and hard work can achieve." It wasn't exactly glowing praise, but coming from her, it meant something. Some days, she even lingered after class to offer tips or recommend new pieces for him to try. Though her efforts were clumsy at times, Marcus appreciated the effort behind them. Change, he realized, didn't happen overnight, but it happened nonetheless. Still, not everything was perfect. There were moments when old prejudices reared their ugly heads, reminders that progress wasn't linear. A substitute teacher once mistook Marcus for being in the wrong classroom because this is advanced music theory. Another time, a group of older students made a joke about his band, implying they only got attention because of diversity quotas. Each incident stung, but Marcus refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he channeled those feelings into his music, using it as fuel to push forward. By the end of the school year, Marcus had become a fixture at Lincoln Middle School, not just as a musician, but as a role model. Teachers praised his perseverance, and students admired his humility. When awards were handed out at the annual assembly, Marcus received the Most Improved Student trophy, a recognition that felt bittersweet given how much he'd already accomplished. As he stood on stage holding the award, he scanned the crowd, meeting the eyes of his family, friends, and even Mrs. Harper, who gave him a rare smile. That night, as Marcus sat alone in his room reflecting on the year, he thought about how far he'd come. He remembered the sting of Mrs. Harper's sarcasm, the weight of feeling invisible, the doubts that had gnawed at him in the beginning. But he also remembered the power of music, the way it connected hearts, challenged assumptions, and gave voice to emotions words couldn't express. Looking ahead, Marcus knew there would be more challenges waiting for him. High school loomed in the distance, full of uncertainties and unknowns. But for now, he felt ready. ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that he had something special to offer the world. And as he drifted off to sleep, the faint strains of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata echoing in his mind, he smiled softly, knowing that his journey was far from over. It was just beginning. Years passed, and Marcus grew from the quiet, uncertain boy who had walked into Lincoln Middle School into a confident young man whose name echoed far beyond the small town he once struggled to fit into. Music became his lifeblood, carrying him through high school and eventually leading him to a prestigious conservatory in the city. The lessons he learned during those early days about resilience, self-belief, and the power of art to transcend differences stayed with him, shaping not only his career, but also the way he interacted with the world. By the time Marcus graduated from college, he was already making waves in the music industry. His performances were known for their emotional depth and technical brilliance, qualities that critics described as otherworldly, and audiences simply called magic. He traveled across continents, playing on stages that glittered under the lights of international acclaim. Yet no matter where he went or how much success he achieved, Marcus never forgot the pivotal moment when a single piano performance silenced a room full of skeptics and changed everything. Back in his hometown, memories of Marcus lingered like ripples in a pond. Former classmates often mentioned him fondly, recalling how his talent inspired them to pursue their own passions. Some even admitted regret for not standing up for him sooner, acknowledging the biases they hadn't questioned at the time. But perhaps the most surprising transformation came from Mrs. Harper herself. Long after Marcus had moved on, she occasionally brought up his story during parent-teacher conferences or school assemblies. "I once taught a student named Marcus Johnson," she'd say, her voice tinged with both pride and reflection. "He reminded me, and everyone else, that assumptions can blind us to greatness if we're not careful." While she never explicitly apologized to Marcus, her actions spoke louder than words. She began mentoring other students from underrepresented backgrounds, encouraging them to explore music despite societal barriers. Her teaching style softened, becoming less rigid and more compassionate, as if Marcus's influence had planted seeds of change within her. For Marcus, these stories reached him secondhand, shared by friends or family members who still lived in the area. At first, hearing about Mrs. Harper's evolution made him smile wryly. It was strange to think that someone who had once doubted him so fiercely could now champion causes close to his heart. But over time, he came to see her journey as proof of something important. People could grow. They could learn. And sometimes, all it took was one powerful moment to spark that growth. As his career soared, Marcus used his platform to advocate for inclusivity in the arts. He visited schools, gave masterclasses, and launched scholarships for young musicians from marginalized communities. "Music saved me," he told a group of wide-eyed students during one such visit. "It gave me a voice when I felt voiceless. My hope is that it does the same for you." His words resonated deeply, especially among kids who saw pieces of themselves in his story. On rare occasions, Marcus returned to Lincoln Middle School to perform or speak at special events. During one such visit, he found himself standing in the same music room where it all began. The old piano still sat center stage, its keys worn but gleaming under the soft light. As he ran his fingers lightly over them, memories flooded back. The tension, the fear, the triumph. Nearby, a group of current students gathered around him, asking questions and marveling at his achievements. One girl shyly handed him a folded note that read, "You make me believe I can do anything." In that moment, Marcus realized the true legacy of his journey. It wasn't just about proving Mrs. Harper wrong or earning accolades. It was about showing others what was possible when you refused to let prejudice define you. By sharing his story, he hoped to inspire future generations to rise above doubt and embrace their unique gifts. Looking back, Marcus knew his path hadn't been easy. There had been moments of pain, frustration, and uncertainty. But each challenge had shaped him into the person he was today, a musician, a mentor, and a symbol of resilience. As he stepped away from the piano, and into the applause of another captivated audience, he carried with him the knowledge that music, and the courage to play it, could move mountains. And maybe, just maybe, it could continue to soften even the hardest hearts.